The first time I realized an HOA could take away something as basic as my daughter's daycare, I honestly thought there had to be some mistake. I kept staring at the letter in my hand, hoping the words would somehow change if I read them one more time. They didn't. My child care assistance had been suspended. My second job was hanging by a thread, and the reason was not because I failed a requirement or ignored a deadline. It happened because someone decided my home needed permission before a government inspector could walk through my front door. My name is Elena Marquez. I was 36 years old, living in Chandler, Arizona, raising my 4-year-old daughter Sophia, while working 2 jobs just to keep our little apartment-style townhouse and our lives moving forward. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I wasn't trying to get special treatment. I was simply doing what millions of parents do every day, waking up before sunrise, making breakfast, packing lunches, dropping my daughter off, working, coming home exhausted, and doing it all over again the next morning. The child care assistance program I qualified for was not a luxury. It was the reason I could keep working. It covered about $900 a month in daycare costs, and without it, my entire schedule would collapse. The program had one important requirement, though. A safety inspector had to visit my home within 30 days to make sure the environment was appropriate for childcare. It was a normal process. I had no problem with it. In fact, I wanted it done as quickly as possible. So during the second week after receiving my approval notice, I scheduled the inspection. I remember that morning clearly because I actually felt relieved. For the first time in months, I thought maybe things were finally starting to get easier. I cleaned the house, organized Sophia's toys, checked the smoke detectors, and even joked with my daughter that the inspector was coming to make sure Mommy's house was not secretly hiding a monster under the bed. She laughed and told me the monster would probably be scared of my vacuum cleaner. It was one of those small moments that reminded me why I was fighting so hard. Then the inspector arrived. He barely made it past the entrance. A security guard from the community stopped him and told him he could not enter. The reason? The HOA had created a new rule requiring 72-hour advance approval before any outside inspector could access a property. I stood there confused because nobody had ever told me about this rule. There was no letter, no email, no announcement, nothing. I asked the guard where I could find the policy. He simply pointed me toward the HOA office and said, "You will need to clear it with them." I immediately submitted the approval request. I explained that this was not a personal visit, not a contractor, not some random inspection. This was a state-required child care safety inspection with a deadline attached. I expected someone at the HOA office to understand. I was wrong. Days passed. No response. I sent emails. I called. Nothing. By the third week, I started feeling that familiar panic every working parent knows. The feeling that one small problem can turn into a disaster because there is no room left in the schedule or the budget for anything else. So I called the HOA president directly. His name was Richard Helston. He was the kind of person who always sounded calm because he believed being calm meant being right. When he answered, I explained my situation as politely as I could. I told him my subsidy depended on the inspection being completed within 30 days, and I only had about 10 days left. I expected him to say he would look into it. Instead, he told me, "Our approval process takes 4 to 6 weeks." I thought I had misunderstood him. I said, "I'm sorry. Did you say 4 to 6 weeks? Because I have 10 days. He paused for a moment and replied, "That's not really our problem. Residents are responsible for planning ahead." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was loud or cruel, but because of how casually he said it. Like my daughter's daycare, my job, my entire month of bills were just paperwork on his desk. I hung up the phone and sat in my car for almost 10 minutes. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry yet. I was just trying to understand how someone could look at a situation involving a child and still see only a procedure. At that moment, I still believed there had to be a misunderstanding. I believed once someone explained the consequences, the HOA would fix it. I had no idea that the delay was not an accident. And I had no idea that this small rule would eventually expose something much bigger happening inside our community. The hardest part about losing something important is not always the moment it happens. Sometimes the hardest part is the slow realization that the people who could have helped you simply chose not to. That was exactly what happened during those final days before my deadline. I checked my email every morning before I even got out of bed. I checked during my lunch break. I checked while sitting in the parking lot between jobs. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was the HOA finally approving the inspection. Every time it wasn't, That little piece of hope got smaller. By day 28, I was no longer asking for a favor. I was begging for someone to simply process a request that should never have been delayed in the first place. I went to the HOA office in person because I thought maybe a face-to-face conversation would change things. I brought every document I had: the approval letter from the child care program, the inspection appointment confirmation, the deadline information. I walked in carrying a folder like I was preparing for court, even though all I wanted was permission for someone to make sure my home was safe for my daughter. Richard Halston was sitting behind his desk. He looked at the papers for a few seconds and leaned back in his chair. "I understand this is important to you," he said, "but we have procedures for a reason." I remember looking at him thinking, procedures are supposed to help people, not trap them. I said, "Mr. Halston, if this takes 4 weeks, my daughter loses her daycare assistance. I lose my job. Is there any way you can just approve this?" He folded his hands and said, "If we make exceptions every time someone has an urgent situation, then what is the point of having rules?" That was the moment something changed inside me, because I realized he wasn't confused. He understood exactly what was happening. He just didn't think my situation mattered enough to move faster. Day 30 came, and the deadline passed. No inspection, no approval, no exception. A few days later, I received the notification I had been dreading. My child care assistance was suspended. I remember opening that email while sitting at my kitchen table. Sophia was coloring beside me, completely unaware that the small piece of stability I had fought so hard to build was disappearing. She looked up and asked, "Mommy, are you okay?" And I smiled because parents do that. We smile when we are scared. We smile when we are exhausted. We smile because our kids deserve to believe everything is going to be okay. But inside, I was trying to figure out how I was going to solve a problem that someone else had created. Without the subsidy, daycare became impossible. I tried cutting expenses. I skipped things I normally bought. I rearranged schedules. I called every family member I had. But the reality was simple. I could not work 2 jobs and take care of a 4-year-old at the same time. 45 days after the inspection was blocked, I lost my second job. My manager was understanding, but understanding does not pay rent. He told me he knew I was a good employee, but they needed someone who could consistently show up. I remember walking out of that workplace, holding my final paycheck and feeling like I had been pushed backward after spending years trying to move forward. Meanwhile, Richard and the HOA moved on like nothing happened. Then, almost 2 months after my original request, the HOA finally approved the inspection. 52 days after my deadline, 52 days after the damage was already done. The inspector came, completed the visit, and everything passed. My home was safe. My daughter was safe. The entire reason for the delay had been completely unnecessary. But when I later crossed paths with Richard, he didn't apologize. He didn't ask how my daughter was doing. He simply said, "Maybe this will teach you to follow the proper procedures next time." I just stood there. Because there are moments when someone says something so revealing that you don't even need to argue anymore. His own words told me everything I needed to know. That night, after putting Sophia to bed, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. The same paperwork that had made me feel powerless weeks earlier. But this time, I started looking at it differently. I wasn't just a mother fighting a system anymore. I remembered something I had almost forgotten about myself. Before I became a full-time mother trying to balance 2 jobs, I spent 14 years working in Arizona's family services system. I had spent years helping families access child care programs, investigating barriers, and understanding exactly how these systems were supposed to work. I knew the rules, I knew the deadlines, and more importantly, I knew when someone was using a rule as a shield instead of following the purpose behind it. I went back through every email, every message, every date. Then I found something that made my stomach drop. The 72-hour HOA approval rule had only existed for 3 months. Residents had never been properly notified. There was no community meeting, no official announcement, nothing. It had quietly appeared, and somehow it was now being used to block a government-required inspection. The more I investigated, the more questions I had. I contacted other residents and discovered I was not the only one. 3 other mothers had experienced almost the exact same situation. Their inspections were delayed. Their assistance was interrupted. Their families struggled because of a rule that was never clearly explained. And then I found the email that changed everything. It was a message Richard had sent to board members discussing these inspections. In the email, He wrote that government programs brought unnecessary oversight into the community. When I read those words, I finally understood. This was never just about paperwork. It was about control. Richard didn't see these inspections as a requirement designed to protect children. He saw them as something inconvenient that he wanted removed from his neighborhood. And now, I had something I didn't have before. I had proof. I stopped trying to convince the HOA to do the right thing. I started preparing to make sure they had to answer for what they had done. I organized every document, every timeline, every message, the approval letter, the denial report, my employment records, the emails, everything. Then I filed complaints with the appropriate state agencies and requested a formal investigation. I knew this fight was bigger than just my lost income, because if Richard had done this to me and 3 other families, there was a chance he would do it again to someone who didn't know how to fight back. And that was the moment I stopped asking for permission. I started demanding accountability. Once the investigation started, the entire atmosphere inside our community changed. For the first time in months, Richard Halston was no longer the person asking everyone else to explain themselves. He was the one who had to answer questions. And I think that was the moment he finally realized this was no longer a simple disagreement that he could bury under paperwork. The same rules he had used to delay my inspection were now being examined line by people who actually understood why those rules existed in the first place. Investigators reviewed the timeline, the emails, the approval requests, and the communication records between my family and the HOA. They looked at the dates carefully because dates tell the truth when people try to change the story. They saw that my inspection request was submitted on time. They saw that the HOA had been informed about the deadline. They saw that Richard knew exactly what would happen if the approval was delayed. And still, he allowed the process to move forward at a pace that guaranteed failure. The part that bothered me the most was not that a mistake happened. Mistakes happen. People miss emails. People misunderstand procedures. That is normal. What happened here was different. Someone saw a problem coming, had the ability to prevent it, and decided that following his own process was more important than helping a family avoid losing essential support. The investigation also uncovered that I was not the only person affected. The 3 other mothers I had spoken with shared similar experiences. Different homes, different circumstances, but the same pattern. Their inspections were delayed. Their assistance was interrupted. Their families were forced to deal with consequences that had nothing to do with their ability to qualify for help. They had followed every requirement given to them. The only thing standing in their way was an HOA rule that many residents didn't even know existed. When those stories became part of the investigation, people in the community started paying attention. Neighbors who had once avoided getting involved began coming forward. Some told me they had always felt uncomfortable with how Richard operated. They said meetings became less about listening to residents and more about reminding people who had authority. One neighbor told me, "I thought I was the only one who felt that way." And honestly, I think that was the biggest problem. Not just one person abusing power, but many people staying silent because they assumed they were alone. Richard had created an environment where people questioned themselves before questioning him. But once the first person spoke up, others realized they had a voice too. Eventually, the HOA board held an emergency meeting to address the situation. I remember sitting there and looking around the room. The same people who had once looked down at their papers and avoided eye contact were now openly asking why the rule was created, why residents weren't informed, and why urgent situations were ignored. Richard tried to defend himself. He said he was only enforcing community standards. He said he was trying to protect the neighborhood from unnecessary outside interference. But the problem with that argument was simple. Protecting a community does not mean making life harder for the people who live there. A neighborhood is not just houses, fences, and rules written in a binder. It is made up of families. It is made up of children. It is made up of people who are already doing everything they can to keep their lives together. In the end, Richard was removed from his position, and the HOA was forced to completely review how these types of requests were handled. The financial consequences followed as well. My family received compensation for the months of lost childcare assistance, the wages I lost after leaving my second job, and the emotional impact of everything that happened. The court later recognized additional damages because this was not just about money. It was about the stress of watching my daughter's routine disappear, the fear of not knowing how bills would be paid, and the frustration of knowing that the situation could have been avoided with one simple decision. But even after everything was settled, I never looked at that experience as just a victory against one person. It changed the way I saw communities and leadership. Because power does something interesting to people. Sometimes it reveals who they really are. Some people get authority and use it to protect others. Other people get authority and use it to make sure nobody challenges them. Richard had a title. He had a position. He had control over meetings and documents and procedures. But what he forgot was that leadership is not about how many rules you can enforce. It is about how responsibly you use the trust people give you. The day Sophia returned to daycare was one of the happiest days I had experienced in a long time. I remember watching her walk in with her little backpack, completely excited to see her friends again. She didn't know about investigations or illegal complaints. She didn't know about HOA meetings or government programs. To her, it was simple. She was back where she belonged. And for me, that was enough. A few weeks later, while we were making dinner together, Sophia asked me something that caught me off guard. She said, "Mommy, why couldn't I go there before?" I looked at her and realized children don't understand the battles adults fight behind the scenes. They don't understand why a signature, an email, or a delayed approval can change someone's life. They only know that something they love suddenly disappeared. So I sat beside her and said, "Sometimes people create rules because they believe they are helping. Sometimes people forget that rules are supposed to help people, not hurt them. But there are always people who will stand up when something isn't right." She smiled and went back to coloring, probably already thinking about something completely different. But I knew that moment would stay with me forever, because this whole experience taught me something I hope I never forget. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to make a difference. You just have to know when something is wrong and have the courage to say something. HOAs, organizations, and communities all need rules. Without rules, things fall apart. But rules without fairness create resentment, and power without accountability creates damage. The real question is not whether rules should exist. The real question is who benefits from those rules and who gets hurt by them. So now I want to ask you something. Have you ever dealt with a situation where someone used a rule, a policy, or a position of authority to make your life harder instead of better? Do you think Richard was simply enforcing HOA procedures? Or do you think he crossed a line when he ignored the consequences for families like mine? Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations are important. Sometimes a story that starts with one person standing alone ends with an entire community realizing they were never powerless. If you believe fairness matters, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the biggest changes begin when one ordinary person decides they are done staying silent.